Howdy. Thank you for joining us here on Storytime. I'm Murph. In this episode, we go back to the lands. Episode 2 of Chapter 1, Something is Happening. Just get caught up, though. Previously in the lands, we heard Jess and Gary discussing how they're worried about the spirit and what's happening to it. We also heard the old man on the ledge. He's also very concerned about what's happening in the lands, and his old wolf Sheba was suggesting to him that maybe he should do something. What else happened in the lands last time? Well, we had Gonzo decide that he wants to try to get more money out of the tribe, so he sent Grimmer off to get Sheriff Bob so he could write up a law stating that the tribe will now have to sell their goods in his stores. And then we had Maddog, who was thinking back to 7 years ago when his best friend Mahone took off, left the lands, and hasn't been seen since. So he handles it the best way he knows, and that's to go to River's Edge Terrace and get in a game of Hold'em, which just so happens that he knows everyone at the table. So he's having a good old time. And of course, Drake is taking care of things outside, so that's always a good thing. And then finally, we heard 3 members of the Neutral Lands army get beat up by a mighty wind, and that's where we left off. So in this episode, we pick up where Ava, Mitch, and Peter got attacked by a wind and knocked unconscious, and we see what happens from there. So let's move on. Let's enter the lands. Let's go. 1 and a 2, and away we go. Welcome to the lands. Episode 2, Chapter 1, Something is Happening, Part 2. Our quote for this episode:
"What I am saying is, something is happening."
Doc Moran. Around the same time that Peter, Ava, and Mitch were knocked unconscious, Maddog took a look at the pocket cards he'd been dealt. The 2 of hearts and 7 of spades. Great, he thought to himself, but showed no emotion to his fellow card players. But then something odd happened. His cards changed to the 5 of spades and the 5 of clubs. Before Maddog could react to the sudden change, the room began to shake. He looked up and noticed no one else was reacting. Not only that, but all the cards on the table were face up, and they were all 5s. He looked back at his whole cards, and they had changed again. This time they were the King of Spades and the Jack of Diamonds, and their faces were very familiar. The King's face was Gonzo's, and the Jack's face was Grimmer's. Grimmer's face winked just as the cards changed back to 5s. "Whoa!" Maddog exclaimed as the room continued to shake, but no one else seemed to notice. As the room continued shaking, he heard his name being whispered loudly. He looked down at his pocket cards, and they were special cards. They had a castle and a duck on them. Then they changed again. This time they were both the 10 of clubs. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The 10 of clubs. That was a warning card. Then he was once again looking at Gonzo and Grimmer. "What the heck?" Maddog yelled. Everyone was looking at him, but not reacting to the room shaking. Then their gazes went from him to Doc Moran. The whispering of Maddog changed to Sarge yelling, "Doc Moran!" Maddog turned to see Doc Moran was slouched over, his head resting on the table. And just as quickly as it all started, it went back to normal. The room quit shaking. The cards were all face down. His cards returned to the 2 of hearts and the 7 of spades. Sarge had jumped from her seat and was shaking Doc Moran. "What just happened?" Maddog asked, confused. "It looks like Doc Moran may have had a heart attack," Sarge answered as she felt for her pulse. But then Doc Moran lifted his head off the table, took a couple deep breaths, and looked around.
I'm fine,"
he said, a little breathless. "Are you sure?" Sarge asked.
Yes, I'm fine."
Maddog was still looking around the casino. No one else had reacted to the room shaking. He looked back down to his cards, 2 of hearts and the 7 of spades. What the heck just happened? Mad Dog asked again. Doc Moran passed out, Mad Dog, Big O answered, a little annoyed with Mad Dog. No, I'm talking about the room shaking and everything. The others at the table looked around at each other. Not sure what you're talking about, Mad Dog, Sal said. Nothing was happening like that, but it sure was scary when Doc just passed out. Catman showed up with a glass of water. Might I suggest we take a 5-minute break? Catman said. The others agreed. Let's make it 10 minutes, Catman continued. I have a few things I have to take care of. Like a shaking room, Mad Dog said bluntly. Big O and Lady Fuller shook their heads. He just never stops, Lady Fuller said. Shall we finish this hand, play highest pocket wins, or take back the blinds? The dealer asked. Everyone looked at Mad Dog. I don't care, Mad Dog said as he continued to think about everything. Then he remembered his pocket cards. Let's just take back the blinds. Everyone agreed. The hand is dead, the dealer announced. We will resume in 10 minutes. Mad Dog stood up and looked around the casino again. He just couldn't figure out what had happened, but something told him Doc Moran would know. Around the same time Mad Dog's cards started playing tricks with him, 2 pirates stood at the bar deep in the pirates' lair of Orleans, waiting for the bartender, Marguerite, to hand them their pints. As she did, one of the pirates tossed her a coin, which she caught in midair. Enjoy, mateys, Marguerite said with a smile. Cheers, the 2 pirates responded. They turned and walked away from the bar. As they did, they passed a booth where another pirate sat, passed out. They looked at him, then back over to Marguerite. She just smiled and nodded. Captain Marley's out again, eh? One of the pirates said to her. Certainly looks that way, she replied. As the 2 pirates headed towards the table at the other end of the pub, she too looked at the pirate in the booth, and her smile faded. Captain Marley was hunched over in his booth, his forehead barely on the edge of the table. A full pint was sitting right next to his head. He moaned as he relived a time in his past that was haunting his dreams. Captain, we must return fire! A shipmate screamed as cannonballs flew all around. Hold your fire! Captain Marley yelled, eyeballing the approaching enemy ship. Are you trying to kill us? Exclaimed another shipmate. Captain Marley just stared ahead, his eyes as sharp as his mind. There was no alcohol in his system to distort his thinking. He knew what he was doing. Or so he thought he did, for heading right for him was a cannonball. He stood, motionless, knowing something wasn't right. There was no cannonball heading for him in the past. This was new. He just stood there as the cannonball smashed into his stomach and carried him off. The cannonball hit him with such force that it knocked the air out of him. He tried to scream but couldn't. He could see himself floating away from his ship when Captain Marley quickly sat up. So much so that he smacked his head against the back of the booth. But he didn't notice the pain in his head because he couldn't breathe. He lurched forward, almost as though doing so would dislodge whatever it was that was not allowing him to breathe. It didn't work. He looked around the pub and realized everything seemed to be shaking and he could hear screaming. He looked at the 2 pirates who had just sat down at their table. They were looking at him, one of them shaking his head. They weren't acting like they heard any screaming. He then turned and looked at Marguerite. She looked concerned and was saying something, but she wasn't screaming, nor was she reacting to the shaking. He closed his eyes as he tried to take a deep breath. Finally he did, just as the shaking and the screaming stopped. He took a few panicked breaths and smacked his dry lips together. He opened his eyes and Marguerite was standing at his table. She was wearing a tight blue dress which showed her lovely figure with a black leather vest. She was saying something, but he couldn't understand. He tried to nod his head yes, but it just swayed around. I fine, he was finally able to say. Fine. She said something that sounded like, are you sure? Captain Marley looked up at her. He tried desperately to form something that could convey his feelings, but all he could muster up was, Fine, I'm fine. How are you? Oh, Marley, she replied. What am I going to do with you?" He struggled to lift his hands in the air. As he did, he pointed to her. But was there screaming?" "No," she said, matter of fact. "As usual. It's all in your head." No. This was different. I almost died." "Uh-huh. You always almost die, Marley. Let me get Shane to take you home." He shook his head and closed his eyes. No. I'm good. Just let me." He trailed off. She put her hands on her hips and stared at him a few moments. He looked up at her and struggled to form a smile. She shook her head and returned to the bar. Captain Marley tried to follow her with his eyes, but he couldn't keep his head from swaying from side to side. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back. In his head was the sound of cannon fire and pirates screaming, "Captain, we must return fire!" The sliver of a moon provided very little light for the tall, thin man who stood at the desk staring at the monitor. The flashing cursor did more to light up the Orbitron's control room than the moon did. It flashed at him, almost like it was daring him to type what was in his head and hit enter. He ran his fingers through his wiry, thinning hair and let out a high-pitched laugh. "What am I doing?" the professor asked himself silently. "If I do this, she is dead for sure." He stood and stared a few moments longer, then typed on the keyboard. The cursor moved a few times, then stopped. It flashed again, daring him to hit enter. He backed away from the monitor, shaking his head. I just don't know. Spirit, help me here." Then the room started shaking. What the? The room shook. He was pretty sure he heard screaming. He grabbed the chair next to him as he looked around the room. Is this really happening? Certainly seemed like it. He closed his eyes. The screaming and shaking stopped. Well, I guess I have my answer. He hit enter on the keyboard and smiled. The cursor flashed a few more times, then the screen went blank. Then, on cue, all the equipment around him shut off. The man smiled and nodded. Just like we planned. Ha! He let out another high-pitched laugh as the phrase reminded him of the hundreds of times he had heard it from his former partners. From his coat pocket, he pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the keyboard. I'm so sorry, Dr. Stacy, but we just can't finish this project. He turned and looked out the large window behind him. Through the window, he could see the giant contraption that had been his project. He drew in a deep breath. Oh, man, what have I done? This is crazy. The man smiled. It's crazy, but doable. He grabbed the chair, sat in it, and rolled to the blank monitor screen. He then kicked the panel at his feet. He reached under the desk and kicked the panel again. This time it moved in. He crawled under the desk and exited through the slightly ajar panel, and he was gone. The old man was wrapped up in his thick blanket and was sitting in his old wooden chair. He opened his eyes only to realize his chair was not on the ledge of splashing red rock, but was situated on the very front of a steam locomotive that was barreling down the tracks at a high rate of speed. He was zooming by the old plantation house, heading towards Orleans. To his left was the River of Wonder. To his right, after passing the old plantation house, were the regular railroad tracks. What is happening? The old man exclaimed. He was rapidly approaching the town of Orleans, but something wasn't right. There seemed to be a tunnel directly ahead of him. What is that tunnel doing there? He no sooner had said it when he entered into the tunnel. It wasn't very long. Before he knew it, the mighty locomotive shot out of the tunnel and he was zooming through the kingdom. The locomotive had come out of the drawbridge tunnel and was zipping by the tiny kingdoms. It was heading right for the canal cave that led to the little villages. Only thing was, in order to enter the cave, the locomotive would have to travel on the water of the canal. Before the old man could let out a scream, the locomotive leaped off the banks of the canal and was swallowed by the cave. This was an even shorter tunnel. As he exited this tunnel, the old man saw a giant monstrosity. He knew the tracks were taking him down the main thoroughfare of Techland because he recognized the mover, which ran overhead. But he had never seen the giant, evil-looking contraption that resided above the mover's main loading platform. He didn't get much time to look at it since the train was moving even faster now. However, he nearly jumped out of his chair when the locomotive's mighty whistle screamed as they passed the Orbitron and headed towards the lagoon. He thought for a moment that the speeding locomotive was going to plunge right into the lagoon, but it didn't. Instead, the wheel screeched as the train took a hard right and turned toward the small train station. The old man gripped the arms of the old wooden chair as the locomotive headed towards the tunnel just beyond the train station. He knew that tunnel, and it brought back haunting memories. The train entered the tunnel and really picked up speed. The old man pulled the thick blanket over his head, frightened by what he feared he would see in this tunnel. The locomotive was descending and bouncing wildly like it was going downstairs. He pulled the blanket down below his eyes and was surprised to see that he and the locomotive were barreling down the main street of Merchant Valley. He could barely catch his breath with how fast the locomotive was going. He had finally had enough. "DW!" he exclaimed. "Slow down!" The locomotive was streaking down the main street of Merchant Valley. The shops on both sides were just a blur. "DW, slow down!" the old man screamed. He turned and looked at the engineer, and his eyes opened wide, for chasing the locomotive was a ferocious dinosaur. "Faster, DW! Faster!" The old man realized that DW wasn't at the throttle. No one was at the throttle, and the giant locomotive was moving even faster. He turned and looked straight ahead, afraid that at any second the ferocious dinosaur was going to snag him up with his powerful jaws. He tried to stand, but couldn't. The force from moving at such a high speed would only allow him to lean back in his old wooden chair. He tried to bring the blanket up over his head, but the blanket flew out of his hands, so he gripped the armrest as tight as he could so he too wouldn't fly away. The locomotive was now creating a dust cloud as the dirt and debris of the neutral lands kicked up all around it. He tried to yell as he could see the mighty locomotive was charging right for the statue in Hubland, but he couldn't yell. In fact, the old man found that he couldn't even breathe. He grabbed his chest as he realized the locomotive was going to smash right into the massive base the statue rested on. With every ounce of energy, he silently screamed, "Spirit, help me!" As the old man leapt out of his old wooden chair and fell on the ledge of the splashing red rock. As he awoke, he was grabbing his chest and was trying desperately to take a breath, but couldn't. He rolled over on his back and looked at the dark sky. It seemed there was screaming coming from somewhere far off in the lands. He thought it was all over, until Sheba came over to him, stared right in his face, and let out a long, peaceful howl. It was like she was summoning something from way beyond to come help her friend. And that something answered her plea. The old man took a deep and very satisfying breath. It seemed to relax him. He lifted his hand from his chest and patted Sheba on the head. "Thank you, my old friend," the old man said to the wolf. "I don't know what just happened, Sheba, but I fear trouble has come knocking, and the lands are in big trouble." As Peter, Ava, and Mitch were being thrown down by a mighty wind, Grimmer rode his horse over the grassy knolls in the dark. The darkness didn't bother him one bit. He looked up at the sliver of a moon and smiled. He would rather ride in darkness. He rode at a good pace, moving towards the kingdom to Rosie's Tavern. Grimmer was an extremely talented gunslinger, which was one reason he was known as the Grim Reaper. He had a job to do, and he was focused on getting it done. As he approached an old dead tree, he knew that he was getting close. Then he heard what sounded like someone stepping on an old dead twig. He dismounted his horse to the left and had his guns in his hands before he even set foot on the ground. He rounded the back of his horse, guns drawn, and pointed towards the old dead tree. "Don't come out knocking or you'll be a-dropping," he said to the darkness. He heard what sounded like a moan from the old dead tree. "Who's there?" he asked, raising his guns. He was normally not one who was unsure of himself, but this just didn't seem normal. There was another snapping sound, then another. The Grim Reaper moved his head in as if to hear the sound better. He whispered to himself, "It doesn't sound as much as twig snapping as it does glass breaking." The Grim Reaper spun around to the other side of his horse just as it seemed the old dead tree had exploded, like it was made of glass. The Grim Reaper saw shards of glass fly past him, but something wasn't right. He was well aware that his horse did not react at all to anything that was happening. He rounded the back of his horse like he had before, guns drawn, and there stood the old dead tree, just as it always has been. "Buckshot and buffaloed," he said to no one. The young gunslinger, sly smile on his face, approached the old dead tree. He gave it a good long stare. He hadn't spent much time around it, but he felt there was something different about it. He gave it a good look. "I've always heard you were cursed," he whispered to it. "Why did you pick tonight to show yourself?" The old dead tree seemed to give out a big sigh. The young gunslinger took a step back. He spun around to the back side of the old dead tree just to make sure someone wasn't hiding behind it, playing him a fool. No one was there. He smiled at the old dead tree and holstered his guns. "Not quite sure of these shenanigans," he said as he backed away from the old dead tree. "But I have a job to do, and you will not keep me from doing it." He gave the old dead tree one more stern look, still with that sly smile on his face. Then, in one smooth move, he mounted his horse. He rode his horse all around the old dead tree, just to make sure there was no one hiding there. Then he gave one final nod to the old dead tree and continued on his way. In a dark room, high up in the tower of the castle of the kingdom, an old man was lying in bed, his eyes bloodshot and his mouth wide open. He looked at the sliver of a moon that was just appearing through his window. It seemed to be teasing him with just enough light to show how all alone he was. He was grasping his covers, which he had up to his chin, his tattered, dirty white beard mangled on top of him. His breathing was labored. With a single candle lit by his bed, he waited for death.
"Come now, old friend. Just take me,"
he said in a barely audible whisper.
"This old man is finished."
He took a sharp, shallow breath through his open mouth.
"Please take me tonight. I cannot wait any longer."
A tear dropped from his right bloodshot eye, much as it had done on so many nights before when he begged to be taken from this life. He took another sharp, shallow breath. The candle flickered, then went out. He slowly turned his head and looked at the candle. This was new. The candle had never gone out before. His room was so dark.
"Finally,"
he said, closing his eyes. His mind started racing.
"I should have done more with my life. I should have fought more for what I knew was right. I should have done more. I should have stopped."
He stopped breathing. His chest felt like someone was sitting on him. He opened his eyes as he struggled to breathe. His room was shaking, and he thought he could hear screaming.
"So this is death,"
he thought to himself, and felt his lungs burning inside him.
"Not so bad."
His hands let go of his covers as his bloodshot eyes started to roll back into his head.
"Feels kind of comforting,"
he thought, but then he realized he could breathe. He took 3 quick breaths and then one deep one. "Am I dead?" he asked himself. There was no answer. He got lightheaded. He felt as though he had just run a marathon, like all the energy what little he had been drained from him. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. On the other side of the enormous castle of the kingdom, King Michael stood on his bedroom balcony, looking out over the kingdom below. The buildings below glimmered in lights, giving the whole area a magical look in the darkness. Didn't matter that there was just a sliver of a moon. The kingdom was still aglow. This was when King Michael really appreciated his kingdom. He always felt the Ancient Ones did a wonderful job designing the kingdom, whoever those Ancient Ones were. Much time had passed and many disasters had happened, so there is little known about how his kingdom, or all the lands, really came about. A lot of speculation, but no sure facts. And King Michael was a man of facts. Facts, spreadsheets, budgets, and benchmarking. He wasn't exactly sure who designed and built his kingdom, but he knew darn good and well he was going to do everything in his power to keep it running. Tonight, however, there was an uneasiness in the air. He could feel that something was happening, or going to happen. He looked out over the shining carousel, expecting to see something, but all appeared peaceful. Then he turned towards the big white mountain, off in the distance to his right. It was so beautiful. He could just barely make out its silhouette in the darkness, and, for a second, he thought it looked almost sinister. But he pushed that thought right out. That mountain was his. It belonged to the kingdom, not to the horrible land of technology, or what do they call it now? Techland. They had taken it from him, and he felt there was really nothing he could do. That wasn't really a foreign feeling to him. Many years ago, he felt it when his first wife just up and left him. No reason why. She left him a note that simply said, FYI, there's more to life than being a queen. I'm off to find it. Where she went, he never knew. She left him with a daughter and a son, and he felt powerless. He just let her go, just as he did his daughter a few months ago. She left him a note saying, FYI, off to find mother. He hadn't heard from her since. If not for the support of his lovely new wife, Michelle, and the love of his son, Prince Sean, and the strength generated from his good friend and most trusted advisor, Kat, he probably would have given up. But his current wife stood behind him, and Prince Sean promised never to write him a note. Still, he wondered where his previous wife and beautiful daughter were, and what was happening to them. And now the corporation had acquired his mountain, and his heart sank as he thought about all the horrible things they were probably going to do to it. What really angered him more than anything was his inaction. He could feel his anger begin to boil up inside him when he heard the voice of a person who could calm him down. What are you doing out there, dear? Queen Michelle said as she came out onto the balcony in her very elaborate robe, holding a cup of coffee. It's so cold out here. Come back to bed. I'm sorry, my dear. I'm just thinking about how much I've lost. A wife, a daughter, a mountain. It really is difficult being a king. Well, if you think about it, she responded, then took a sip of coffee. You didn't lose a wife. She left you. And that was a long time ago. So now you have me. She flung her head back and flashed him a big smile. And you know what they say, like mother, like daughter. Besides, she'll be back when she sees what the real world is like. As for that mountain, who cares? It wasn't really within our boundaries, and it was a huge liability anyways. But it is so beautiful. Beauty doesn't pay the bills, unless you're talking about me, she said again, flashing him a big smile. He smiled back. He knew she was right. She was always right. His wife and daughter did leave him, and as for the mountain, it did produce a large expenditure and upkeep with minimal returns. Bottom line, he replied, you're right as usual. What would I do without you? She responded, FYI, you'd be a failure. She shook her head back and forth, which she did when she knew she was right, making her short black hair fling around her head. They both laughed and started back inside the castle. He turned and looked back outside. That uneasy feeling still bothered him. She watched him for a moment, gave a little smirk, and shook her head, then grabbed his hand and led him to the bedroom. I think the kingdom's business can wait, she said. It's time for you to take care of the queen's business. Sergeant Catman were taking care of Doc Moran as the others got up from the table to stretch their legs and grab something to drink. "You okay, Doc?" Mad Dog asked, leaning over to him.
"Really, I'm fine."
"Maybe you just need some fresh air," Mad Dog suggested. "Come on, let's take a walk."
"That sounds like a good idea,"
Doc replied.
Maybe you should have been a doctor, Mad Dog,"
Doc Moran said with a chuckle. "There'd be a lot more people in Boot Hill if that ever happened," Sarge said. She and Catman helped Doc Moran to his feet. "I can get him for the rest of the way," Mad Dog said. Both Sarge and Catman looked at Mad Dog suspiciously. "Suddenly a caregiver, Mad Dog?" Catman said. "Suddenly grow a big nose, Catman?" responded Mad Dog. Catman laughed and threw his hands in the air. "I know what that means," Catman said. "Sarge, why don't we let the two men go get some fresh air?"
"I don't require assistance,"
Doc Moran stated.
"I can walk myself."
Mad Dog and Doc Moran headed towards the exit of River's Edge Terrace. As they stepped outside, Doc Moran took a couple of deep breaths. Mad Dog made eye contact with Drake, who could barely be seen in the shadows, and nodded, indicating everything was okay. Drake was holding a club in his hand, which he used to give Mad Dog a little salute. Mad Dog did a second take, not quite sure why Drake had a club. He shook his head, figuring there had to be a reason, and he would find out later. Mad Dog then escorted Doc Moran away from the doors of River's Edge Terrace. "Hey, what the heck happened in there, Doc?" Mad Dog asked.
"I'm not sure, Mad Dog. Suddenly, I couldn't breathe."
"No, was the room shaking?"
No, but I heard screaming, like hundreds of people were in extreme pain."
Interesting.
"You didn't hear screaming?"
Doc Moran asked. "No, I didn't. It was strange, though. The room was shaking, and I heard people calling my name." Mad Dog took out a cigarette and lit it. "What the heck was that, Doc?"
"I don't know. I've never experienced it before. It wasn't so much like I couldn't breathe. It was more like the life was being removed from me. I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't have something to do with the spirit."
"The spirit?"
"Yes, like it was sending a message, trying to get our attention."
"Ha! Maybe it was asking me to keep it alive."
"Or maybe telling you it's too late."
"What the heck does that mean? Doc, what are you saying? The spirit has died?"
"What I am saying is, something is happening."
Mad Dog looked around and took a deep breath. Was something happening? Certainly seemed like it. Was something different? He couldn't tell. He took a big drag on his cigarette and blew the smoke out. Drifted up, then out, the slight breeze carrying it somewhere. "Well, I suppose we should head back in," Mad Dog said. "Still lots of money to win," he said, trying to take his mind off what just happened. He watched as Doc Moran headed into River's Edge Terrace. Took a drag on his cigarette. I guess I should have listened to Mahone and kept the spirit alive. He took one last puff of his cigarette, then flicked it over the porch rail into the street. He looked around, then followed Doc Moran into the River's Edge Terrace. Just as Mad Dog walked through the door, two large men moved from the river towards River's Edge Terrace. "You sure that was Mad Dog?" one of them said to the other. "Oh, yeah, that was Mad Dog," the other answered as they stopped by the stairs leading to the front entrance. "I recognize that disgusting habit of flicking his cigarettes away. It's him. Then Gonzo's reward is good as ours. What's the plan?" The other man looked to his friend to the left of him and said with a smile, "We're going to go in there and tell him he better come quietly with us. Otherwise—" The man drew his fancy gun and spun it on his finger. He then threw it in the air and caught it by the nozzle. He flipped it behind his back and over his left shoulder and caught it. He flung it in the air again and caught it by the handle. "Otherwise, we make him come with us." "Well, what if Drake's in there?" The man smiled. "We kill him." Thank you for listening to The Lands, Episode 2, Chapter 1, Something is Happening, Part 2. We look forward to you joining us again real soon. Woo! A lot going on there, eh? Well, that's episode 2. Guess you need to stick around and listen to episode 3, find out what's really happening, because we know something is, right? A couple of things about this episode, and so far as the writing, the background behind it. I mentioned in episode 1 how I've been writing this for a really long time. Started out as a smaller story, obviously, and has grown. In this episode, there are actually 2 original scenes that were in the very first manuscript, I suppose. Episode 1, there were just a few snippets from the original. There was no actual scene from it, just little bits and pieces. But in this episode, there are 2 original scenes. Also, there's a lot of foreshadowing in this episode. There's a lot of things that are kind of referencing maybe stuff that's going to happen or has happened in the past. And you know, there's obvious in the with Maddog and the cards changing and the warnings that he's getting. So I enjoy doing that in the writings of knowing what's going to happen and kind of giving a little bit a hint towards it. Everything, you know, has a purpose and has a reason. So when it's talking about certain things, you might be, what in the heck is that all about? There's a reason for it. Episode 2 introduces you to the old dead tree. That becomes very significant later on. And of course, you meet the inhabitants of the kingdom. So King Michael, Queen Michelle, Merle, and so many more. The other thing, you know, I found interesting or wanted to do in episode 2 is kind of show you a little bit of the lands. So in the old man on the ledge in his dream, you get to kind of visit some of the different places in that scene of the lands. So I hope you can stick with it. I hope you enjoyed that, and that you're looking forward to episode 3. I do have a message here from Doc Moran. He wanted me to pass this along to you. So Doc Moran says,
If you are interested in what's happening in the lands, make sure that you hit subscribe and notifications so you don't miss a chance to visit us again. And let us know what you think by leaving a comment. I hope you'll visit us again real soon, because, as you know, something is happening.
Thanks, Doc. Again, hit notifications, hit subscribe, ring the bell, leave comments, do all that other stuff. But do make sure you come back, and remember, keep the spirit alive.